Hopefully that's showing the right one.
Yeah, great.
Good.
We can see your slide now. Perfect.
Yeah, thanks. So I just wanted to give some quick updates on where things have got to so far, and just as a very quick reminder, the intention always was with the advent of iNaturalistUK that we would restart the import process that we trialled a few years ago to bring the UK records from iNaturalist into iRecord for a variety of reasons, including enabling them to be linked to the UK grid reference system and to make them available for flow through to the national recording schemes and the local record centres, who most of whom are already accessing records from iRecord. So that was the intention, and the import of records from iNaturalist into iRecord started up again. I think it was about the beginning of October. So not all that long ago, but this is a quick update on where we've got to so far. So at the moment, there are just under 1 million iNaturalist records within iRecord, and the records are coming through from iNaturalist if they meet the conditions described there. So first of all, they need to reach the research grade level of agreement in iNaturalist. The species name has to match the UK species inventory, which is the species dictionary that we use within iRecord and for the NBN Atlas. And the records have to have a license that actually allows them to be shared through to iRecord and the NBN Atlas. So, as I say, about 1 million records, just under, are in the system at the moment. And as of 6th of December, just about a quarter of those have been reviewed by the verifiers within iRecord, and the overall sort of progress, if you like, is that about 4.6 on average are rejected across all the species groups, and about 1.6 are redetermined. That is, they are re-identified as something different within iRecord, but there's a wide variation between the different taxonomic groups as to where those numbers end up. And just to look at that a little bit further, these are the top 15 species groups in terms of the numbers of records within those species groups that are actually coming through iNaturalist. So flowering plants are the most recorded group within iNaturalist. And as you can see here, one of the really good things is that there are lots and lots of different species groups being recorded across iNaturalist. I'm only looking at the top 15 on this slide, but there are a lot more species groups with slightly smaller numbers of records as you go down the list. And the percentage of them that have been reviewed does vary enormously, as I say, for a number of reasons. We don't have verifiers for every single species group within iRecord, so that obviously explains some of the ones that haven't been looked at very much. And also, as I say, it is only a couple of months since this process was started, and inevitably it does take time for the verifiers who are active in iRecord to actually see the data and catch up with it. And given that, I think it's actually quite encouraging to see the very good progress that has been made in a number of the species groups. I'm just going to pick out the three sort of highest numbers in these three columns, just to raise a few other issues. So the largest percentage reviewed happens to be for the true bugs, which includes the shield bug recording scheme and a couple of others, and they've obviously been working very hard on catching up with those verifications in iRecord, but yeah, quite large numbers for some of the other groups as well, and we're very grateful to the verifiers for tackling this additional inflow of data. In terms of the numbers that are rejected, the largest number on the screen is for moths, but I know that a fairly significant proportion of that 17.2% is not necessarily because the records are wrong, but it's because the records have already been sent to the county moth recorder via another route. And this is always going to be an issue with the multiplicity of ways that people can send records in, that some of them will have flowed through the system via other means, and that therefore we do end up with the potential for duplication. So that needs to be borne in mind when looking at some of these numbers. And then of the redeterminations, the largest number of redeterminations by percentage is for the fungi, although I think that's based on a rather small number of records that have been looked at so far. And as I'm sure many of you are familiar with, identifying fungi from photos is a really challenging, if not impossible in some cases, thing to do. And it's perhaps not surprising that there are some redeterminations being applied by the verifiers there. But as you can see, there is lots of variety across the different species groups, and as time goes on, it'll be interesting to see where the patterns lie with this. One other thing to pick out here is the low percentage of bird records that have been reviewed so far, and that's mainly because we don't really promote iRecord for bird verification use, and we are shortly going to be establishing the link between iRecord and BirdTrack that will enable those bird records to actually flow on yet again through to BirdTrack, and the verification will be picked up there, so that number will increase once that starts happening. A couple of issues that have been picked up, which I know some of you on the call are very familiar with, is the issue of the imprecise locations that some of the iNaturalist records can end up with. And this can be for a variety of reasons. Some of them just seem to be users who don't actually zoom in very far to the map when they're adding their record, and you can end up with these very imprecise grid references from that result. Some users choose to obscure their location. They may not want to pinpoint where they actually live. There may be all sorts of good reasons to obscure a location. And iNaturalists themselves, the system applies an obscured location to a range of sensitive species, which I think is based on the IUCN threat categories. So there has been some difficulty with bringing some of these less precise records into iRecord and allocating a suitable grid reference to them. And we made some adjustments a few weeks ago to try and improve the handling of the really vague records. And the example on the screen there is just one I came across where it appears to be a record that somebody had just added without zooming into the map at all, and it's ended up with this enormously imprecise accuracy of 2,500 kilometers radius of where the thing might actually be. So some of them are really a long way out in terms of precision, which does raise the question of as to whether the records at that level of imprecision are actually worth importing at all. And at the moment we are continuing to import them, and as the chart here shows you, they are quite a small proportion of the total number of records. Most of the records in iNaturalist have a perfectly good precision attached to them. But even though they're a small proportion of the records, there are still several thousand of them that have these rather more imprecise locations. And I think there's still some debate to be had about whether it is actually worth bringing those records in at all, or whether they're just so vague that they're not really worth people looking at any further. But you never know when one of those vague records could just be something really interesting that's worth pursuing with the original recorder and trying to find out more about it. Giselle and others have been looking at options for how to deal with locations for people who don't want to give a precise location to a particular point, and there are some ways that iNaturalist can be used to help with that. And the idea of using pinned locations, which we might come back to later on, is one way that you can set up a location and give it a controlled degree of precision, and then you can reuse it over and over again. The other issue that crops up with some of the recording schemes at least is the pseudonyms, where people haven't actually given their real name as the recorder of the record, and that is sometimes seen as bad practice. The ideal biological record, if you like, should have a recorder name attached to it so that it's clear who's recorded it, and that person can be given credit for their record, basically. But equally, there can be really good reasons why people don't want to expose their real name in connection with the places that they've been recording. So I think there does have to be a little bit of give and take here, but at the moment it's still an area that does cause concern. Within iNaturalist, you do have an option to set your username, but also to set a different display name. And it's the display name that comes through to iRecord as the recorder name. So there is a way of using your real name for some purposes without necessarily exposing it as your username on iNaturalist. And for some people, that might be a way of getting around this particular issue. And the final thing I just want to say is that we are drawing up these guidance notes as we come across them and as people make suggestions to us. This was a note that was published in the recent NFBR newsletter, for those of you who may have seen that. NBN has been building up links to these sorts of resources on their website, and we will be adding more of this to the help pages within iRecord as well. But clearly there's a role that all of us can play in trying to sort of get some of these messages out about how we can make best use of iNaturalist so that the records do flow through to iRecord in a way that they can be verified and shared more widely. Okay, and I think that's all I had to update on where we got to so far.
Thank you, Martin. There are a couple of questions in the chat. So John Pilgrim has said, on obscured records, in the first meeting, I thought we were told that verifiers in iRecord would have access to precise locations. Surely this is possible.
Well, I'm not going to say it's impossible, but it's not at all easy, because the whole system depends on the iRecord uses the API that iNaturalist makes available to share its records, and that API does not include the precise locations. Separately, NBN receives a direct export from iNaturalist of the records database for the UK, and that does include the precise locations, but so far at least there's two difficulties. One is the technical difficulty of how we link those precise locations back to the data that's coming through the API, but there's also a difficulty around what the iNaturalist users have agreed can happen to those obscured locations, and whether they would be happy for them to be shared with the verifiers on iRecord, and whether what controls would then need to be in place to make sure they don't get shared more widely than that. So at the moment, it's not something that is possible to do in the short term, but it is something that we're aware would be good to find a resolution to if we can.
Thank you.
Martin, this is John, can I just comment on the last issue you raised there about whether iNaturalist users have agreed to share their locations? Yep. That's something that could be fairly easily resolved. There could be a user on iNaturalist called iNaturalistUK or iRecord or whatever, and you can trust that user with your true locations. I've done that, for example, for local recorders in this area.
Yes, that may be part of the solution to this. I think it would probably be quite difficult to get a large-scale agreement to that from all the iNaturalist users, simply just letting people aware that that's what they would need to do. But that's obviously something that could be pushed forward. It still leaves us with the technical challenge of how you actually link that through to the data that's coming via the API. Thank you for that, John. That is certainly one of the options that we are aware of that might provide a way forward. Yeah.
We also have a question from Claudia, who said, what's the data flow like for sensitive species records on iNaturalist? Can the record centres access them at full resolution once they're transferred to iRecord?
Same answer as before. No, you can't at the moment. And again, it's partly because that information is not within the API. And this brings us back to the same question we've just been saying about the direct export as to what we can do with that precise information and who we can share it with.
John has raised another point, which is around this display name issue, and that doesn't actually help, as it's still easy for anyone to view that when clicking through. And he says there's a need for an obscured real name on iNaturalist. So I don't know if anyone has any further comment on that. And then Steve.
I think, Lisa, sorry, Kieran here, it definitely does help. I wouldn't say it doesn't help, because anybody who's not bothered about obscuring their name could then use it for that function. If there might be a need to allow the option to obscure the display name as well. But I mean, I don't know how big this need is for obscuring names. On iRecord, obviously, that's not something that we do, or anyway. But I don't know what what the community reason within iNaturalist is for that, if I'm honest.
Was that what you had your hand up for, Kieran, or were you also going to raise another point? I saw that you had your hand up.
Yeah, no, that was earlier. It's for another point. So I think John was going to say something then. So
I'll come back to you then, Kieran.
I was just going to clarify the need as I see it. Two principal reasons. One being that most people are inputting into iNaturalist in real time. And obviously you don't want people knowing where you are, particularly that you might be away from home or on holiday. So there's a sort of security reason. The other reason is that you might not be on lines that you're permitted to access, although that's perhaps a less legitimate reason.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right, John. And there are a number of reasons why people might not want to have that location made completely public against their name. And as I say, I think that there is a question. Some recording schemes are quite happy to accept records with a pseudonym, as long as the pseudonym is, they know where it's come from and they know the context that it fits in with. And if you go to iNaturalist and you look up the pseudonym, you can make contact via adding comments to records and things. So it's not as if the records are completely anonymous. But as I say, just at the moment, it's something that there are a range of different views out there. And I know that some recording schemes are very reluctant to accept records that don't have a genuine name. But there's all sorts of questions around this. I mean, any of us who put down what appears to be a genuine name against a record, we could be making that name up anyway. So it's you've never got a guarantee that you know exactly who you're dealing with in the online world. I think this is going to have to be a mixture of letting people know what the options are, but accepting that there will have to be different choices in different circumstances.
Thank you. We'll go to you, Kieran, for one last comment before we move on to the next section of the agenda.
Okay, I'm not sure if this is the right place to raise it, but I can only stay till 3, so I wanted to make sure I did. It's kind of, when Martin showed us the figures for the percentage that have been reviewed and not accepted, I don't know if he saw way down the list of number of records with earthworms, we're sitting on 100% rejected, and that's because none of the records are for species that can be identified from a photo. So there's two things that I wanted to kind of raise here. First of all, is there a way of putting a difficulty level with ID on individual species or groups, like we have in some groups on iRecord, that will at least let people know that when they put in a record of a group on iNaturalist, that actually that species, it's not possible to identify it from a photo. That could relieve some of the extra verification pressure that's going to, for example, moth recorders that are getting a ridiculous number of records. It's easy for me to keep on top of them with earthworms. Another thing I've noticed with the earthworms is that iNaturalist is recommending a single species for every record, pretty much. And I think that's because the machine learning, it's pushing it in a really polar direction. So I'm getting records of one species mainly, and there are species that look quite different from a photograph. So I can tell it's not that. I can't maybe tell what it is from the photo, but I can tell it's not that. So I think with these difficult to identify groups, iNaturalist is possibly just not the right platform for submitting records for them. So is there anything we can do to mitigate a lot of records coming through for species where it's never going to be a suitable platform? And I want to make the point off the back of that. I see the real benefits of using it for things like hedgehogs and for certain butterflies. So it's not an anti-iNaturalist comment. It's this just maybe isn't right for everything.
No, Kieran, that's absolutely taken in the spirit in which you intended it, and I think that's a very valid point. We won't have time to answer that here today or even immediately, but I think that's a really useful suggestion as well, looking at that difficulty level associated with the different taxonomic groups and whether those could be handled differently within iNaturalist, or whether we just push traffic away from iNaturalist for those groups, to the extent that we can, for those groups where it's just creating a load of poor data, essentially. Okay, we're going to move on to the next section of the agenda. I know that there's perhaps still a few folks with hands up, and I'd encourage you to put your comments in the chat, and we will download the chat at the end and make it available to you all, so that, for example, Martin can pick up on any issues that we haven't had the time to address, and so that we all have a record of that anyway. So thank you very much, Martin, for that. And I have to say, I particularly enjoyed the mental image you created when you inadvertently suggested that some records might fly rather than flow through the data pathway. Better for some groups than others. Okay,